Professor Mark Riboldi, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. You have written extensively on the fragmentation of party politics in Australia. To what extent do you see the rise of minor parties and independents, especially the Teals and Greens, as indicative of a populist movement or a broader realignment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I should say that I'm not a populist scholar, so I'm not a scholar in populism. So, my knowledge of populism literature generally is probably not as in depth as probably some of your audience there. I think what's been going on in Australia probably for the last 50 years or so is a sense that there's something wrong with the current system, with the way that politics is working, the two-party system we have in Australia, and there's a demand for better representation. That has meant that people have been voting more and more frequently for independent or minor party candidates, or basically non-major party candidates. Some of that research that I've done with some colleagues is showing that trend away from major party voting is kind of realigning parts of the left and the right, rather than being more of a kind of a populist break from it. So yeah, I'd probably say it's more of a broader realignment than anything else.
Right. In your co-authored article, you distinguish party-like independence from traditional party politics. Do you see this trend as fostering a new form of populism, or rather as a correction to major party ossification?
Yeah, so what we're talking about with party-like independence and independence operating in a party-like fashion is where in Australia, a central organization called Climate 200 has basically been collecting funds from various different sources, backing particular candidates in election campaigns, particularly in relation against Liberal Party candidates. And they've been using that fund to do things that parties would normally do. So, for example, to fundraise centrally, to do research, to do mass communications. So where normally an independent candidate might only have the resources to campaign in their local seat, or to do a particular type of things, Climate 200 means that, or the existence of Climate 200 as a vehicle means that these independents can get party-like resourcing. So I think again it's a reaction to the major party system, and the Climate 200 in particular has been a reaction to the right-wing Liberal National Party in Australia, and in particular in terms of two things. One is their failures on climate and their inability to adjust and to deal with the climate crisis in a serious way in terms of their policy, and also in terms of the representation of women. So all of the Climate 200 backed independents in the 2022 federal election that were elected were all women, and they largely defeated Liberal National Party men.
Right. How do you interpret the Greens' recent electoral losses in the lower house within the broader context of Australia's shifting political cleavages? Was this a rejection of their platform, leadership style, or something more structural like preferential voting patterns and redistributions?
I think in terms of the Greens, it's important to understand that, yes, they lost seats in the lower house, so the House of Government, but they held the same amount of seats in the Senate, so the House of Review, and they've consistently had won the same amount of seats, so six. Across the 6 states, they've basically got 2 senators per state, and they've done that for the last 3 elections. So the vote for the Greens in the Senate is very stable, whereas as we saw in the most recent federal election, in the lower house, it's not as stable, and the Greens went from having 4 seats down to having 1. If a major party with 80 something seats lost 3 seats, they might not worry too much about it. But when you've only got 4 seats, losing 3 is quite a lot. And so I think the the tension for the Greens here is that there's a big difference between getting a consistent vote in the Senate, so in that upper house to get those senators elected. You pretty much, if you're getting, if your national vote is around 12% or 13%, you can get, and the Greens did get, those senators elected. So that's a 12% national vote. That's very different from winning a lower house seat, which in Australia, to do consistently, you probably need to have a primary vote of over 40% to be doing that consistently. So I think in what happened in the last election, in part, it was a correction from the election before, where the Greens won some seats due to the preferential system, which I think we'll talk about in a bit. And then the surge of the left-wing Labor Party and the collapse of the right-wing Liberal Party meant that the alignment of the top three candidates in those seats changed order. And so the Greens lost three of their seats. So I don't think it was necessarily a rejection of their platform or leadership style or things like that. I think part of it's just about when you have lower house seats, sometimes you win them and sometimes you lose them.
Right. You have emphasized the role of legitimacy and power dynamics in how political actors, especially civil society organizations, mobilize support. How do you see populist rhetoric reshaping public perceptions of legitimacy among CSO and minor parties?
Yeah, I think it's a danger when we're thinking about populist rhetoric and the kind of messages that appeal, the populist messages that appeal to people, thinking about, whether it's in parts of Europe or the UK or the United States or even Australia, it's important to, I think, recognize we shouldn't write off those people who are responding to that rhetoric as being anti-democratic or undemocratic. I think a lot of the time there's a real response to the political conditions and the social conditions that people are in that they are responding to with demand for a greater say about things. So and I think that's definitely exploited by aspects of the right, the way that Donald Trump or Nigel Farage or right-wing figures within Europe, the way that they talk about democracy and legitimacy is a very narrow, a very neoliberal in a sense view of democracy and legitimacy, which is, let's talk about, here's a problem, I will fix it, and kind of investing all of that power in one person. And we know that that's dangerous and can lead to autocracy and things like that. So I think it's, I was rereading some notes of from Chantal Mouffe's For a Left Populism this afternoon, which is the one bit of literature about populism that I've read, where she's talking about that need for a form of left-wing populism, which is, responding to the same type of concerns that people have about, being disenfranchised in the system, being, that widening gap between the better well-off and the less well-off. But the left can do that, and I think Mouffe talks about this, and I would say the Greens respond to this in a way in Australian politics, in a way that increases democracy rather than leads to things like autocracy. So for civil society organizations as well, there's a real role and importance for them to be exhibitors or exemplars of what democratic behavior and democratic activity is. Because if they're not, if it's the civil society organizations and your left-wing minor parties are not going to provide an example of that type of potential democratic populism or left-wing populism, then people are just going to respond to the right-wing organizations.
Right. Your typology of CSO activities outlines both service delivery and systemic advocacy. How do you see populist actors either co-opting or challenging these CSO functions, especially during elections?
Yeah, that's a good question. The most recent election in Australia, a quite populist right-wing figure in the form of a coal baron, basically Clive Palmer, who ran under the the Trumpet of Patriots Party. He spent millions and millions of dollars, putting up billboards, social media advertising. I think pretty much everyone in Australia got 4 text messages from him during the campaign. And his message was quite a lot around like universalist claims like free education or canceling student debts and things like that. So very I might call socialist concerns that people might want. So I think there's and that's a response to people's concerns. They're not going to actually do it, and Trumpet of Patriots kind of went backwards in the election. Um, but on the other side of things, in terms of advocacy, we've seen from right-wing governments in Australia a move to delegitimize advocacy as a role for civil society and organizations and NGOs. We've had, I think, 20 to 25 years of right-wing governments in Australia over the last 40 or 50 years, and they consistently will try and undermine the ability of organizations to engage in advocacy. Basically, the claim from the government is that we give you money, we give the NGOs money, and so they should shut up and deliver services rather than advocate for change. Even the left-wing governments in Australia sometimes have a bit of an attitude of the left-wing civil society organizations should help us get elected, and then they should shut up and let us do the job rather than complaining about things. So I think it's quite a challenge. For me, I think that these functions, particularly systemic advocacy, is such an important democratic function for civil society organizations to have a pluralist society and to have multiple voices in the political system.
Right. In discussing power distribution within civil society, you raise concerns about homogeneity in the Climate 200 movement. How might this lack of diversity undermine their capacity to challenge right-wing populism or broaden their democratic appeal?
Yeah, so the Climate 200 independents in Australia are very middle class and they're very white. So in Australia's political spectrum, you might have 5 positions. You would have, the centre-left Australian Labor Party, the centre-right Liberal National parties, the coalition. On the left of the Labor Party, you would have parties like the Greens. On the right-hand side, you would have parties like One Nation, who are, very populist right-wing movement. And thankfully, even though they've been around for quite some time, they're not particularly electorally successful. And then so in the middle of those is Climate 200 and those Climate 200 backed independents. So it's very middle class, it's very white, it's very centrist. So I don't think that Climate 200 are a response or have an ability really to challenge right-wing populism. I think that they're a realignment of part of the centre-right of Australian politics. So yeah, I don't think that they are a challenge to right-wing populism. I think they're just a bit of a realignment towards the centre for the right of the Liberal Party.
Right. You were critical of Adam Bandt's leadership being perceived as too insider or technocratic. In the context of Australian populism, how important is anti-elitist performance or outsider image, even for progressive candidates?
Yeah, I think it's very important. My criticism of the Greens during the election was more about the lead slogan or their message that they had in the campaign. So basically, they pitched around the potential that the Greens could play in a minority government. And that was a lot of the messaging that they were talking about, even the Climate 200 independents as well. A lot of polling in the lead up to the elections showed the potential for a minority government. And so I think both the Greens and Climate 200 were pitching into that. Late in the campaign, it became reasonably clear that the right-wing Liberal National Party were not campaigning very well and their vote was collapsing, and that became much more likely that the Labor Party would take government again or reclaim government, but with an increased majority. So that meant that that technocratic message of the Greens just didn't really cut through, or didn't seem to cut through particularly with people, at least not in my view. And I think that, like, to the substance of the question, I think that the people are sick of that kind of talk. People don't want to hear politicians talk about the machinations of parliament, whether it's minority government, who's going to do what, whether it's preferences and who's going to preference what. I think that people want to hear politicians talk about ideas, and they want to hear them talk about a vision for Australia that's, bold but realistic at the same time. So I think it's a problem if we don't have political parties, and if you have a left-wing movement like the Greens, if they're not talking about that vision strongly, then there's then they are really just, I think, falling into some of that more elitist type of politics.
Right. The Greens' emphasis on housing and renters' rights was arguably a populist move, targeting a disenfranchised demographic. Do you think this issue can serve as a long-term populist wedge against both major parties, or was it electorally premature?
I don't think it was electorally premature. The Greens in Australia have been campaigning on housing at state and federal level for 10 to 15 years, if not a little more. And there's places in Australia where there are more renters in electorates than there are homeowners. There's an increasing demographic of people in Australia who are locked out of the housing market. It's not just young people. There are, people kind of getting older, and people around my age who have been, and will be lifelong renters. Another aspect is the rental system in Australia is heavily geared towards landlords, and so the power distribution between landlords and homeowners and renters is very, very imbalanced. So I think it's a perfect issue for the Greens and other social democratic institutions to campaign on. And the discourse in Australia, political discourse in Australia for the last 3 years has been heavily dominated by housing. The government has invested a lot of money. The Greens were able to negotiate, I think, about an extra $3 billion from the government for housing in the last term of government. But the problems around housing are not going to go away. The prices are going up. The price of houses is going up. The price of rents is going up. There are no, as yet, systemic changes to the incentives for people to just buy investment properties and to raise the rents again and again.
Right. You argue that civil society groups often deploy emotionally charged messaging like truth and stop Dutton. Is this a sign of populist communication logic seeping into the mainstream left, or a necessary rhetorical strategy in the current media landscape?
There's nothing new about emotionally charged messaging in politics. On the left or the right, I think it's a very common tool to, mobilize supporters, to get votes, to, get people to do things. Emotions, very, very popular tool. I don't think it's necessarily anything to do with, some kind of populist communication logic. I think, if you think about the common framing for getting people to do things, that one of the key frames for the union movement for a very long time was the anger, hope, action frame, which is still used today. You communicate to a supporter, you tell them something that the opponent has done, you make them angry, then you give them some hope, saying, well, we can do something about it. And then you give them an action to do, which is, go out and volunteer or do something on the streets. That frame is used by the left and the right all over the place. So yeah, I don't think that using emotionally charged language is a new thing, or, that kind of stuff. I think for the climate movement, there was a bit of a mistake early on, assuming that governments make decisions based on having been presented with evidence, or that governments make decisions based on facts. A lot of policy people and kind of progressive-oriented people I know, they have a belief that if you just make the rational argument, you'll be able to convince someone of something. I don't think that's ever been the case. I think it's a nice rationalist thought, but I don't think it's ever been the case that governments make decisions based on facts. So, balanced messaging has a combination of facts and emotion. So, the strongest type of messaging that I've seen from either, the workers' rights movement in Australia or the climate movement in Australia is based on facts and presents facts very strongly, but it also makes sure that it has emotional language and emotional music and visuals to try and connect with people, because getting people to make decisions is often based on emotion. So I think you need to have emotional rhetoric. It's just whether you can actually back it up with facts or not, or whether, as some populist figures in different places, you're just full of shit. Yeah.
Right. Australia's preferential voting system has helped both minor parties and independents. Do you think this electoral setup inadvertently creates fertile ground for populist insurgents, or does it actually moderate them compared to first past the post systems?
I think it's the latter. I think Australia's electoral system and political system of governments generally means that Australia is governed from the centre. So we have compulsory voting. So you're not just competing for trying to get a small bunch of people to vote. Everyone votes. We have preferential voting, which means that votes tend to slew towards one or the other of the major parties. And the third thing, we also have the proportional upper house. So for me, I think that Australia's political system is a bit of a stopgap on populism and kind of that right-wing insurgency. We've had, right-wing populist figures elected in Australia before. They don't seem very good at staying elected. I think, in our research, the number of One Nation MPs that got elected in Australia, most of them, within 12 to 18 months of being elected, have quit the party and kind of standing on their own. So there's a real, I would say, fragmentation amongst the right in Australia, and they don't have their shit together, basically, in terms of being able to get elected and stay elected and have a political force. And I think the preferential system, while it might help candidates get elected, third-party candidates get elected. In the US, as we know, or in the UK or in other places, that first past the post system can just lock other voices out of there. And so, that kind of the demand for other voices in a political contest can just be, ground down, ground down, ground down until there's that explosion or insurgency at some point. Australia allows for those moments of, an explosion or a rise to a particular voice in a community. But the system also has those checks and balances in them. So for me, I think it's a good stopgap against populist insurgency.
Right. Given the increasing number of independents and minor party MPs, what reforms, if any, do you believe are necessary to maintain the integrity and functionality of parliamentary democracy in Australia?
Yeah, one of the biggest problems in Australia, and I think it's probably the same in other liberal Western democracies, is the impact of big business on government and that the ideas around state capture. So some of the reforms that have been proposed in Australia is to make ministers' diaries and politicians' diaries transparent, so you can see exactly who is meeting with politicians. Other ones is around, we already have laws around the declaration of interests and the things that politicians might own or have investments in, but also trying to stop that conveyor belt from Parliament directly into a high-paying job in industry, and that kind of conveyor belt from student politics into Parliament and then into high-paying industry jobs. And there's a bit of that conveyor belt skips people, it skips real work, and it skips the community. So I think trying to reclaim government for the community in that sense and increase that transparency is a really important thing.
Okay. Do you think the Greens face a strategic identity crisis, trying to be a party of responsible governance while also holding onto their roots in protest and radical critique? Is this attention a barrier to populist appeal or a strength in a polarized political climate?
Yeah, I think this tension is a good thing. There is a tension, and I think it's a good tension for a social democratic party on the left to have. It's basically between the connection that parties like the Greens have to the social movements which they came out of. So whether that's environmental movement, the peace and non-violence movements, or socialist movements in different parts of the country. So there's those connections to those very activist roots that the party comes from. And then the tension is that there are elected parliamentarians and their staff and people are trying to get elected and take part in running the country and being part of government. So that's a tension because there's some people who might argue that the Greens should always stay a protest party. And that they shouldn't take those seats. Their role is to represent activists and to not be compromised by being in Parliament. And then some people might say, well, what's the point of being in Parliament if you can't actually, go on to form government at some point? So I think that tension, though, is really useful. I think it helps to keep a party like the Greens connected to their roots and keep them accountable to those roots. The Australian Labor Party, which is one of the more successful Labor parties in the world, has very strong connections to the union movement still, and the union movement still is able to discipline the Labor Party, and that's a tension as well. The Labor Party can't structurally drift away from its base in the way that the Democrats have in the US, for example. It's just not at this point structurally possible. So I think those tensions are really important in parties. I think that, particularly left-wing parties, I think it makes it harder for them to have a populist appeal, particularly the older that a party gets and the more success that it has. It might tend to, become a bit institutionalized. People want to take less risks because they're interested in keeping their jobs or getting more people elected. But if you've got that tension, whether it's from environmental movements, socialist movements, workers' rights movements, peace and nonviolence movements, there are voices that can appeal to people in a populist way that speaks to their genuine democratic concerns for better representation.
Right. Bob Brown called for greater boldness from the Greens. In your view, what would boldness actually look like in the current political climate? Is there a risk of boldness tipping into the populist demagoguery?
I think if boldness is not coupled with an idea of realism and believability, like I was mentioning before, Clive Palmer and the Trumpeter Patriots were out there during the election saying that they were going to give everyone free education and completely and wipe off student debts and do a whole lot of things that some of them sounded quite good, but people didn't believe them. People didn't have the faith that they would actually do those things. So I think the boldness needs to come in having a form of legitimacy, which a party like the Greens does, to be able to say things. People can believe what the Greens are talking about. The Greens have been around, in Parliament now for well over a decade. They can point to reforms that they have championed or been part of, including around like a national integrity commission, including action on climate change, including, as I was mentioning before, that extra money for housing. People have seen the Greens deliver. So I think that has bought them, for want of a better word, a degree of capital that they can spend on talking about the kind of bold policies that they might want. So yeah, I think in that sense, and I agree with Bob Brown in that sense that the boldness is about selling a bold vision of what Australia's future could be. I read an article today which was talking about the new Greens leadership, where it was saying that one of the former Greens leaders was saying we didn't have new policies. We are just talking about the same things we've been talking about for 10 years. And he was saying it as though he was proud of that. But for me, maybe that's not the kind of thing that people wanted to hear. I mean, perhaps they needed a different type of message, or they were talking a lot about minority government. So yeah, I think that excuse me, boldness is important, but it's important to be connected to a sense of legitimacy and an ability to achieve things in Parliament. And the Greens have that through the balance of power in the Senate and through their history of being and working in government.
Okay, finally, with the continuing fragmentation of both the left and right in Australian politics, do you foresee a populist surge from the right akin to the US or Europe? Or is the Australian political system too institutionally embedded for such movements to dominate?
Yeah, I mean, this might be wishful thinking, but I do think that Australia has some structural resistance to those kind of populist surges. That's not to say that there aren't, right-wing populist movements in Australia. I've mentioned Pauline Hanson's One Nation a couple of times. We, like other places, had protest movements around anti-vaxxers. There's, nationalist movements in parts of Australia which, jumped onto those kind of things. So, we do have like an active right-wing nationalist populist movements in Australia. But I do think that our electoral system is a bit of a stopgap for that. We do have that kind of proportional upper house. So the government has never had, well, not never, sorry, the government rarely has control of both houses of parliament in Australia. So the government will usually be formed having some sense of control over the lower house. So there'll be the in the House of Government. And then in the Senate, they usually have to negotiate. So, similar to the US system, where they have to negotiate the passage of bills with different coalitions of senators. So I think that's a useful stopgap to populism and to have just one party getting in control and just running rampant over the system. I think the preferential voting system, which we talked a little bit about, helps that as well. And then I definitely think that compulsory voting, that people are more engaged in the system, and the pitch in Australia isn't to necessarily narrow groups of partisan voters, but it's into kind of the political center. I think all of those things are a bit of a, not an antidote, but help be a bit of a stopgap that those populist surges that happen in Australia outside of the parliament might break in, but I don't think they get a foothold, and I don't think that they can kind of take control or have as much institutional power as they do in other places.
Professor Mark Riboldi, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Selcuk. Good to talk to you.